So, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, this is now the fourth adaptation of the Mr. and Mrs. Smith property into live action. The very first one was a 1941 film from Alfred Hitchcock. It's really his own only comedy that he ever made. But it is quite different than I think the Mr. and Mrs. Smith property that most people know, because there was a 1996 television show which sort of
Hmm.
turned the dynamic between the husband and the wife into a spy franchise. But then the most popular one, of course, is the 2005 Doug Liman movie that starred Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, really at the height of their powers, the height of their popularity. And I think for a lot of people, that movie was probably more well known for the on screen chemistry, the romance that was developing between those two, as opposed to the actual movie itself. Nonetheless, it was a huge, successful smash hit. Made ridiculous amounts of money. I think like over $400 million at the box office off of this property that was largely, I think, unknown to most audiences. But now
Hmm.
here we are, fast forward about 16 years later. Donald Glover and his producing partner from Atlanta, Francesca Sloan, decided to do a reimagining of this particular property. And he's also starring in the show alongside Maya Erskine. So this show premiered a few weeks ago, excuse me, on Prime Video. We're still waiting to see if it's going to be a multi-season thing, but it does seem and appear to be that Donald Glover and Francesca have ambitions to do more seasons in the future if it's successful enough. But we got the first 8 episodes of this first season that debuted on Prime Video. So with all that out the way, man, I'll pass it over to you. What do you think about Mr. and Mrs. Smith?
Yeah, that original Mr. and Mrs. Smith is the firepower behind it is just so ridiculous. Like literally, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt are like you said, they're at the top of their game. There is just two all powerful superstars who are also simultaneously falling in love in real time. Make this big blockbuster movie, man. But the thing is about that film is, in watching it, of course, it's very beloved. But in watching it, the dynamic between the two was more about, I think, the big action set pieces and them as people and stars, rather than that actual movie fleshing out their relationship. You know what I mean? Like who they're supposed to, who they really are individually, and what it means for them to actually come together and talk about the dynamics of their relationship. And I think this is that take that Donald Glover and Maya Erskine are doing, where we actually are made to care about them as individuals first, and then made to care about what kind of relationship they have in this crazy situation they find themselves in. And overall, I enjoy it, man. I think one thing I want to note here is that Hiro Murai came back again, as he does in most Donald Glover projects, to direct a lot of these episodes, and you can feel it, and you can tell that he's back. A very frequent collaborator with Donald Glover. Almost everything he's made, Hiro has been a part of it. And I can tell and it feels good. It feels like, I think, the dynamic that I was looking for. I know up front a lot of people were like, "Oh, they're not hot enough." Like that was like a big thing I kept hearing over and over. They're not hot enough. But they actually did the work, I think, to make a story that was sound and that felt good and that makes sense. That again not only can contain the dynamic of whatever this, again, prearranged marriage turned into lovers ends up being, but they had cool action set pieces. They had fun making it. They had fun episodes put together to give us, I think, a quick and entertaining watch. And I enjoyed it for the most part. So, man, I really like the chemistry between the two, between Donald Glover and Maya Erskine. And I like the situations they were put in different episodes too, things we just hadn't seen before. In things, I think, that made for an interesting, I think, situation to be. I guess I don't know if not detached, but I don't know if the that the word is, I don't know, maybe like un I don't know, whatever. Anyways, overall, I enjoyed myself. And yeah, if this is the end, that's okay. Like, I enjoyed it for what it was, and if they continue to make it, I think that's okay too. I don't really feel either way. We'll have to see, but I like how funny it was. I like how it was shot. I liked the action and that was happening, and I liked the emotion, and I think it was everything that I thought it was going to be, and I got that. So yeah, I don't really have too many complaints. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but I think they did a really good job conveying what I needed them to convey in this iteration.
So that first Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie that came out in 2005, I'm a big fan of it. I love that movie. It's great. It's great to see the on-screen chemistry between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. It was just, it's intense. It's electricity all throughout that movie. But it does sort of take precedent, or at least the story and the development of the characters takes a back seat, and the precedent is more so placed on the action and really the steamy romance between those two, which for that particular time, totally fine. I have no problems
Yep.
with that, and I think it still works. Like, it's still, you can still feel it between those two. Unfortunately, we know, in real life things have went south for those two in particular, but be that as it may, coming into the show I was skeptical because I just didn't understand the need for it necessarily. But once I saw the trailer and I saw that the angle they were taking was totally different than the movie, that's when I became intrigued, because whereas the 2005 movie, you have Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who are both assassins, and they don't know that each other are assassins. They belong to these competing agencies. Here we have Maya Erskine and Donald Glover, who are strangers, but this is a prearranged marriage. So they go into this agreement knowing exactly what they're getting into. They are joining this assassin company full of Smiths to take on these very dangerous missions, and so they know exactly the type of arrangement that they are embarking on, and it becomes really interesting because the whole show really focuses more on unpacking, I think, the intimacies and the intricacies of marriage, as opposed to
Hmm.
what it's like to be an assassin. Of course, you get all of that spy espionage stuff in this show, because that's really what the nature of their relationship is based on. But the most interesting elements is to see how these two strangers do come together. And throughout the course of the show, we see how their bond strengthens. We see how they come closer together because of these really harrowing predicaments that they always end up in, because they go on very dangerous missions. And then we can also see some of the things that start to chip away at them and drive them further apart. A lot of the times, those things are often outside influences. They're not even things that are within their own marriage that they've arranged for each other. They're coming from their boss, who they don't have a clue who this person is. It's coming from their agency. It's coming from other Smiths that also exist in
Hmm.
this organization. It's come from the people that they encounter on the various missions that they go on. And it's such a commentary just on how all of these outside influences, all of the people that are in your orbit, can truly affect a marriage. And I think that that's a really, really interesting take, and a really interesting look at how two people, despite what they do for a living, you can see how that can start to really affect their relationship. And on top of that, all of this stress and all of this burden is heightened by the fact that their lives are consistently placed on the line all the time. So that makes it really, really interesting. It creates a totally new dynamic. I think the chemistry between Donald and Maya worked out really, really well. I was skeptical of those two in particular leading this property. It just didn't make sense to me. But now that I saw how it
Hmm.
was fleshed out, I'm like, oh yeah, they work really well together, just because of their personalities. She's very cold and calculated and distant. He's not that way, and he obviously has attachments to other people in his life, and that causes all sorts of issues. And it becomes a really, really interesting dynamic. And I think another thing that I really, really enjoy about the show is how they flesh out this world more than what we ever saw in any previous iterations. The fact that this is an underground assassin organization that's operating in the shadows, it's very, very akin to John Wick. There are other Smiths. They're
Hmm.
not the only Smiths. They meet other Smiths in the show. They go on various missions where they're running into other assassins, other would-be assassins. Whatever the case may be, they do a great job, I think, at really expanding the scope of what this world could be. And so if they do pursue other seasons, there's plenty that they can tap into and plenty that they can explore within future seasons and future stories that they tell. But again, I think the best part of this really is the marriage aspect of it, focusing on that. I will say that, people going into this knowing that is sort of taking precedent over the spy action espionage set pieces, that is something to just note, that this is a very talky show. There's a lot of
Hmm.
conversations. It's a lot of dialogue. There's not as much action probably that you would even find in the film. It certainly has some really, really cool set pieces. It is a globe-trotting adventure. Also want to shout them out for going to real locations, traveling to different countries. Everything
Yeah.
looked great. All of the stuff was filmed just extraordinarily well. But it is very much focusing on the dialogue and the interaction between these two characters and just the moments that they're having with each other as this relationship unfolds and develops all throughout the show. So I think it's good. I think it's a very entertaining watch, especially if you're a fan of Donald Glover and his style. You can see some of the DNA of Atlanta, flow over into the show. Of course, with Hero back directing as well, but you can sense some of those Atlanta threads being tied into the show. But just throw on a spy espionage hat over the top of it, and I think you'll enjoy it. I do want to ask you too, though, that this is a really star-studded endeavor. There's a lot of guest
Hmm.
appearances that come through each episode. I think each episode is sort of dedicated to a new guest appearance. You have people like Isaac Gonzalez and Paul Dano, Parker Posey, John Turturro, Ron Perlman. So many people show up pretty much in every episode
Hmm.
of this show. That's kind of the nature of how it's constructed. Did you have a particular favorite guest appearance of a character that you saw come in and just sort of show up for a brief bit of the story?
Ron Perlman, man. It was just kind of unexpected, and he's in like the whole episode. You know what I mean? Like he really is a big part of the episode he's in, and yeah, it was just interesting to see him in that dynamic. I'm used to seeing Ron Perlman on just such a like macho man. The guy he plays is always the main I'm gonna whip your ass kind of guy. He was the opposite of that this time. He was literally supposed to show his age, and so I really liked the showing from Ron Perlman. That was probably one of my favorites for sure.
He was really funny in that episode too, because he was often providing commentary on their relationship unfolding in real time. Like
Hmm.
they had to drag this guy around and just take him from place to place, and this was kind of at the inflection point where the relationship is starting to really crack at the particular time he shows up in the show, and he can just kind of stand back as the older, wiser guy, but also the grumpy guy, and just say like a bunch of shit to them and really be at odds with them. So he was funny. I think my favorite was Sarah Paulson. I loved what she brought to her
Hmm.
episode. She was a
Hmm.
therapist, so they spend an entire episode in therapy. So I love any time a television show can just like really dive into that. Of course, Donald Glover, big fan of The Sopranos. The Sopranos. That whole show is kind of constructed around the idea of a mobster going to therapy. So this episode took a good amount of time at sitting them down and really examining their problems, their disconnect, the things that they're sort of often at odds with. And Sarah Paulson can just kind of sit back and be the therapist, but she has this weird lifestyle around her. Also, like they don't really explore her character, but where she's at in her home and just the way she communicates says a lot about who she is. And I love
Hmm.
how it ended, that particular episode, the way that it ended, because it was quite a shocker, but it was really, really good stuff. But overall, really, really great, I think, first outing for this show. And hopefully, if it's successful enough, which I think it probably is, it's doing really well on Prime Video. Hopefully, they can get future seasons. But folks, those are all of our thoughts on Mr. and Mrs. Smith. If you've checked out the series on Prime Video, hit us up and let us know what you think.